morning, and welcome back to Drawing Journalism. I'm your host, Laura, and today's episode will be about journalism during the 1970s through the 1990s. This is really when television started getting good. I will also talk about many movements and protests going on at this time, as well as the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. Remember, if you have any questions at any point, I have a Google form in the description below, and I will be answering all questions on the last episode of Drawing Journalism, so stay tuned. In the previous episode, we learned a lot about the Cold War and confusion on television, and the African American movement. Did anyone watch the movies I recommended last episode? If so, put it in the Google form. Tell me about the movie. This episode will be more about television, but I'm also going to mention global events. So, let's boogie. I'll give a little background information like usual. In the 1970s, there were a lot of protests, and the president in the beginning was Nixon. First, the protests were mainly about rights, like women's rights, or African American rights, or anti-war. And hippies were the main scene of the youth. So what war were they fighting? Well, they were fighting the Vietnam War during this time. The Vietnam War was a conflict mainly about communism. Even though the public disagreed with the war, Nixon didn't want to pull out because he didn't want the US to look weak. Besides the war, where do people get news? Well, technology was emerging. A popular video game named Pong came out, and the Walkman was introduced. So, mainly television was used to deliver news. Although the space race was over, everyone was excited for the future. One of the more popular journals was the Washington Post. The most popular journalists were Robert Woodward and Carl Bernstein. These two journalists reported about the Watergate scandal. They were renowned for the fake and inaccurate stories, but they accurately reported about this scandal in politics. This actually got them a Pulitzer Award and caused Nixon to resign. A couple months after Nixon resigned, the Vietnam War ended with the US losing the battle. Now, for the early parts of the war, the media was in favor of Vietnam War. However, a conflict called the Tet Offense, which was a major escalation of the war since the north part of Vietnam attacked the south part, ended up leading to a more negative depiction of the Vietnam War. This led the public opinion of the war to dim, although it is unclear whether it was the media reflecting public opinion or whether the media was contributing to public opinion. What do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments or in my Google form. Moving on from Nixon to Ford, Ford immediately pardoned Nixon, which was not favorable towards the public. Furthermore, during Ford's presidency, inflation rose. So when it came to Ford versus Carter, Carter won the election in 1976. Now, does it get better? Not really. During Jimmy Carter's presidency, economic crisis continued, and there was also an Iranian hostage conflict. Carter's media image was not so nice. Not only was energy prices and taxes going up, Carter blamed the American people for the lack of American spirit. Not a great start. The only thing that wasn't going up was Carter's polls, which declined sharply. This poor image led to his failure in the second term, 1980s. Next up, Ronald Reagan. Now, before I get into the 1980s, what was the media doing during this time? Well, they were trying to get their hands on federal documents called Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a government study about Southeast Asia. The New York Times actually got their hands on this from a former government employee named Daniel Ellsberg. This was diminished because of government misconduct. Throughout the 1970s, the public started to distrust the media, which led media putting codes and regulations to limit the involvement of their journalists in activities thought to embarrass their organizations. during the 1980s? Well, there was a global media revolution going on because viewers had more media options thanks to deregulation. Also, more channels were available and content was less restricted. There was also a boom in the magazine industry, and there was specific content for specific people in these magazines. There was also a rise in media personalities, especially with women. One popular one that a lot of people know is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey had one of the more popular shows, The Oprah Winfrey Show, which was a daytime talk show. There was also Barbara Walters specials, where she interviewed world leaders and celebrities. Politically, Reagan was doing okay. He was seen as a strong leader thanks to Michael Deaver, who was Ronald Reagan's top aide. Deaver handled the media during the 1980s for Reagan. He cultivated Reagan as a powerful, patriotic leader. This helped steer the president away from having direct and unscripted contact with the press. While Deaver was able to help Reagan get re-elected in 1984, Deaver would later be convicted of a charge, leaving the administration team before the end of the second term. So, what else was happening? Well, another thing that was happening is Rupert Murdoch, who merged the 20th Century Fox Film Corporation with several independent television stations, which formed the Fox Television Network in 1985. Fox was the first nationwide television network to be created in the United States since the 1950s. Another popular person was Ted Turner. Ted Turner created CNN. CNN was a 24-hour news cycle and had non-stop coverage of the Gulf War. CNN was a hit. CNN could bring news quickly since it was on 24/7. And an example of quick news is when, in 1981, shots were fired at the Hilton Hotel. CNN reported it a full 4 minutes before other networks could. Additionally, CNN released facts as they came, unlike how people got in small doses in the past. Soon, CNN became global, but you'll learn that in the 1990s. So after the Vietnam War, the press kind of changed. Coverage of conflict and war changed within the press in the 1980s because the government believed the press had interfered with the outcome of the war in Vietnam. So journalist cover was heavily restricted when it came to war. One of the last things to happen in the 1980s was the fall of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall happened in 1989 when the Soviet Union said that they're gonna open the Berlin Wall. This led to the east and the west side getting tools to chip away the wall. This chipped away communism, and the Cold War kind of ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Berlin Wall was broadcasted and aired. The entire process and event was aired on television. So were the protests, which took place 5 days before the wall fell. Soon, the 1990s will show the finishing of the Soviet Union, which ended in 1991, and how it served as a metaphor for journalism in the 1990s. Stay tuned for next episode. Thank you for joining me today. Next up will be about the 1990s to the 2010s and how we came to have the media we have today. I will also talk about how media has changed throughout history and how it led up to the events we see today. Don't forget to subscribe and have your questions answered by submitting questions down below in the description. Lastly, visit my Instagram page to get reminders and extra content on media and misinformation. My Instagram handle is @drawingjournalism, and this will also be in the description. This is your host, Laura, signing off.